Hello, in this tutorial I have to go through some of the new features of HDR Expose 3.1, specifically a feature called Pano Prep Batch Processing. Here we'll show you how to prepare your HDR images to be stitched together in third-party applications. Now it's important to say right off the bat that what we do in HDR Expose 3.1 is prepare your images to be stitched together in a third-party application. We don't actually do the stitching portion. Before I get started, let's talk a little bit about the panorama process and how we collect the images. This is one of my favorite places to photograph. This is a shot of Half Dome from the Glacier Point outlook in Yosemite National Park. Now this is a panorama that was stitched together out of multiple individual panels. So I want to talk to them for a moment about how we view a panorama and then how we expose for them. So if you can imagine standing here looking at this vista, you would turn your head from one side to the other and you would scan it and hopefully view something on a good day that looks similar to this. And when you start working with panoramas, the first thing you'll learn is that you have to put the camera in manual mode. The idea is that the exposure varies tremendously as you look through the panorama. So you don't want to be in an automatic setting where for each panel you photograph, the camera is going to change the exposure values. You want to have a constant aperture and a constant shutter speed so that the exposure is the same across the whole frame. With the camera set in full manual mode, with a constant aperture and shutter speed, I start to fire off individual exposures in a vertical format in order to get the maximum resolution. And as you could see, normally the exposures would vary because the brightness in these different frames change. But for this case, since I'm in manual mode, it's all constant. And this is what you would use to stitch together to make a panorama image. Now, if I was working in automatic mode, each exposure would change depending on where the camera was pointed. So you'd wind up with something like this. The same thing applies to tone mapping individual images. So now if I looked at merged images and I was going to tone map each one individually, the software would automatically search for the darkest area of each panel and the brightest area of each panel and adjust the exposure and contrast accordingly, optimizing each individual frame. And that's good for a single exposure or a single scene. But in this case, we want all of these individual panels to be able to stitch together into a smooth panorama. And that's where we would run into problems with this. As you can see here, it's brightened the shadows, and here it's dimmed some of the highlights. The midtones here look pretty good, but when you stitch this together into a panorama, you notice that the shadows here are flat, and you can also see distinct lines between each of the panels that were stitched together, in this case in Photoshop. So the alternative up until now has been to stitch together the images first for each of the exposure brackets. In this case, a -2 EV for the highlights, and then a 0 EV for the midtones, and then your +2 EV to bring out the shadow detail. So you would create these large panorama files, save them out as TIFF files, and then merge them in HDR Expose 3 to do the tone mapping. Now the problem with this is that a 16-bit TIFF file from this particular panorama turns out to be about 210 megabytes per exposure bracket. And these photos were taken a while ago with a Nikon D300 camera, so these are a 12 megapixel camera. If you're using a newer camera, a higher resolution camera, these files will get even larger than that. In this example, I'm showing the case with 3 brackets, so a +2, 0, and a -2 exposure. So the source files alone are 360 megabytes, and that's before you start loading them in and doing the merge process. Now the problem with this is that these files tend to be very large, and it slows down your computer and really drags everything down to a crawl. The other issue is that you're dealing with TIFF files as source images for HDR. Now the problem with TIFF files is that they all have tone curves applied to them, and the ends of the files are clipped. So if you have highlights that are blown out and you clip them, you cannot recover them. So you're always better off using your raw files as your original source images. The new workflow that we're introducing with HDR Expose 3.1 and the Pano Prep Batch Processing feature allows you to start with your original raw files. In this example, again, with just 3 exposure brackets, -2, 0, and a +2 EV range. Each one of the original raw files is just 20.3 megabytes per raw file. That gives us just 60.9 megabytes worth of source images that we're trying to merge. This will make the merge process significantly faster. And since we're working with raw files, we'll get much better results since this is linear raw data that hasn't been clipped or have contrast curves applied to it. This is what the user interface looks like. We arranged the panoramas into scenes and then panorama panels. So one panorama scene contains all of the images from a particular panorama shot. The scenes are grouped into panorama panels. Each panorama panel contains your exposure brackets. And as you can see, in this case again, with 3 exposure brackets, each panel is lined up next to each other, and you can already see the panorama starting to come together here. So since we're able to evaluate the whole panoramic scene essentially as a single image, we're able to apply the same uniform tone mapping values across each frame so that when you stitch them together, you get a natural looking image with deep dark shadows where they belong, nice bright highlights where they belong, and each panel of the panorama stitches together nice and uniformly without any seams. So that's a little background information on how the process works. So now let's step through it in a live demo and create a first set of images to be stitched together for a panorama. So let's take a look at some of the source files contained in this folder. These are all example panoramas that were provided to us by our friend Richard Sisk. Richard will also soon be doing a webinar for us on his HDR panorama workflow. This folder actually contains 3 different panoramas. Now I want to group these into panorama groups. So I have my group panorama set slider down here. As I adjust this slider, this adjusts the time interval between the frames, and you can see as I move the slider, the panoramas start to come together. Here you can see all of the images grouped together for the first panorama scene. All of the second ones are in one group. And you can see that each panorama panel set is grouped together with the proper exposure brackets. Now the one I want to work on here is the last one. So I'm going to keep adjusting my slider until I can get all the thumbnails to show up on the same line. There. Now this particular set is designed to be an immersive 360 panorama set. So not only do I have the camera covering the whole 360 degrees around the center of the tripod, but I also have a frame that shoots straight up to capture the sky, and I also have another frame here where the camera is pointed straight down to capture everything below. Now the time interval to adjust the camera to shoot straight up or to position the camera for shooting straight down is a little bit longer than the time it takes the camera to move from one part of the horizontal panorama sequence to the next. That's why you can see as I adjust the slider that those 2 columns disappear. I'm going to bring them back because I want them all to be treated with the same tone mapping parameters. So now I'm just going to select this one scene, this one panorama scene, and I have all the files selected. And I'm going to do the first step. This is the batch merge process. So I'm starting with raw files. I'm going to use the unified color 32-bit BEF file format. And I don't really care how these files are named, so we'll just start with the first file name in the grouping. And these were static photos, so I'll leave the Merge Static Photos options checked. So now as I click OK, the software is going out and it's automatically merging each one of those 3 exposure brackets in each frame together, at the same time analyzing the whole scene so that we can apply common and uniform tone mapping parameters to them. So we'll just let this process go through. Okay, that process is done. So the next step is to go back in here, and now I'm going to click on the Batch Process tab, and I'm going to open up the folder that contains the BEF files. In this case, it's called Test BEF. And you can see that I have 8 images in this folder. So these are the merged 32-bit HDR files from each of those 3 exposure brackets. So what I want to do now is select a preset that I want to apply to these to do the tone mapping. I have one down here that I created called Pano test, so I'm going to select that. If there's another one that I liked, I can select up to 5 different presets and apply them in the same process. But for this example, I'm just going to use the Pano test that I've created. I want to select 16-bit TIFF output for the best quality merge output. And I'll also go ahead and select Adobe RGB as my color space. And I've selected an output folder here where those files are going to be stored. So when I click OK now, the software is going through and taking those 32-bit TIFF files and applying my preset and automatically tone mapping them and creating 16-bit TIFF files that will be saved in that folder. And here in the dialog, I can see the status of each process. And let's take a look at our results in an image browsing application like Photomechanic. These are the 16-bit TIFF files that I created. We merged together 3 exposures for each one of these panels and tone mapped them with the exact same settings inside of HDR Expose 3.1 using the Pano Prep batch processing tool. You can see the whole 360 round here, as well as the zenith and nadir shots that are needed to create an immersive HDR virtual reality rendering. For more tutorials on our software, please visit our website at www.unifiedcolor.com. Thanks for watching.